how do you measure the long-term roots of economic development? And how do you map that? How can you use mapping to help with that? Most data, when people try to look at economic development, is very recent and very short term. So they can only look at very small changes over time, but there seems to be also some long-term patterns of persistence between different areas of poverty and more economic development. So how do we get at some of the long-term causes? Now, there's many possible long-term causes in terms of violence, through war, through exploitation, through slavery, through colonization, the different types of resources that are available, class structures that are developed. But one factor that we've looked at a little bit is the role of Protestant and Catholic missionaries and religious activities, which plausibly could influence economic development, at least partially, through the spread of education and printing and health institutions and voluntary associations, and at least in some contexts, moderating some of the abuses that happen through colonialism, although they may have abuses of their own. So there's different ways to look at that. One is to link historical missionary activity to current outcomes, like light emission per capita, or current census data or survey data. And so you need to be able to link things through time. So how we do this is, one, for Protestant missions, looking at the locations, the longitude and latitude of the mission stations, which we map, and then determine what's at them and watch the pattern of change over time. For Catholics, we've tried to map the borders of dioceses and other ecclesiastical circumscriptions or provinces. The issue is that they change over time, so you have to update the maps to match currently, or match what the borders were at the time when you have the data. And then you can link these up to a modern location. So this is an archdiocese in Mexico, which is overlapped with municipalities and populated places and churches. And so you can use these techniques for trying to link data through time and try and measure the effect of different types of investments by religious communities on long-term development. However, there's some problems still in terms of isolating what causes what. So one of the issues is, why did missionaries or Catholic religious or other things like that go here rather than somewhere else? And we usually don't know what conditions were exactly like before they arrived. We can look at issues of access, how far from the coast. We've collected a lot of data about the mortality of Protestant missionaries and Catholic religious to try and measure what mortality was like when they first arrived. And we can also look at various types of resources. How we've tried to do this, which is not perfect, but it's a good attempt, is dividing the world into little boxes and then figuring out what the climate and the soil quality and other things like that are in those locations, at least currently, and then linking up to subnational poverty, in this case, Mexico, but it can be anywhere in the world. The difficulty with that is still, you don't know that you've control for everything that influenced where missionaries went or not. So there's some ways that you can try to get at estimation of change in poverty over time. One approach that people have used is estimated population density, which is where there's more economic development, people tend to have more children and live longer, at least historically. Now that's changed somewhat. But that's still estimation, that's hard. Another one is through physical height. So where you have good data like military records or something like that, how tall people are and where they came from, you can try and get at the nutrition they had when they were children. There's some historical economic data for some places, or it's possible also through linking up historical censuses. So Juan Carlos and I have been linking up the populated places in the Mexican censuses from 1795 through the present to try and look at changes in development over time at the subnational level. You can also look at natural experiments. Now, these are ones that are based in Africa, but there could be ones in Latin America, for example, where we can assume that conditions on either side of a border, which is an arbitrary border, were comparable in the past, but it limited the flow of missionaries or some other types of things. So one example of this is, for example, in West Africa, in the Gold Coast, on the left is now the country of Ghana, and the gray area, Togoland, was the German colony of Togoland, but in World War I, it was split in half. It was taken from the Germans, and so the British took the left half, and the French took the right half, and there was this arbitrary border put down the middle of this colony. And the French restricted Protestant missionaries and tried to do education through the state. The British allowed both Protestant and Catholic missionaries, and so education primarily happened through religious communities. And so where you see these diamonds, those are the locations of religious schools. And then the dots are government schools. And so then if we were to argue that like differences in education between Ghana and Togo were caused by British colonization, we would expect a difference in education all along this line here. However, the British didn't allow missionaries in the north, at least except for a small group of Catholics, which they allowed to move across the border south, but they didn't allow Protestants up here. And so if the difference is caused by missionary education, we'd expect a difference on this part of the border, but not at this part of the border. And that's actually what we find. So as you move closer to the border, you see there's primary level of primary education completion. It's a flat line as you're coming close to the border, and then at the border it drops and it's lower on the French side. Or if you look at literacy, it slightly increases as we get closer to the border, and then it drops as soon as we get to the French side. So this border seems to matter in the south. However, in the north, it does not. It's a flat line. So that suggests that missionaries contributed something that led to long-term education. We can look at other natural experiments in Nigeria where Protestant missionaries, well, no missionaries, were allowed in the north for a period of time, and you see differences across this arbitrary line, or through things called instrumenting, where you find things that influence where missionaries went. For example, droughts and floods, which we wouldn't think cause economic development, and then use that to try and isolate the effect of missions. But all of this can be done through trying to map the location of religious groups and what they did, and also to map other types of things that try and help us to get at what are some roots of long-term economic development and other things like that. So thank you.
We have luckily been able to locate the 1930 Mexican census in terms of microdata, which is something that knows lots better Bob than me, and he can address that part of the quality of those data.
Sure. The Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, photographed the entire 1930 Mexican census. And then in order to construct family trees for their own religious purposes, they hand entered the first part of the census, all the names, the addresses, the relationships, the occupations, things like that. So I was talking to them about another project and found out about this and asked if it would be possible to use the hand transcription at the beginning of the census to use computer learning to transcribe the rest of the census. So in particular, we wanted to get the languages that they spoke, their religion, and whether they were literate or not. And so they said, yes, they could. So it's still not complete because they were involved in, they had undergraduates doing it and they worked very effectively in the summer, but then during the semester, they're a little bit slower. But soon we should have the records of everyone on complete data for all the information on the 1930 Mexican census, for everyone on the 1930 Mexican census. Because we're trying to measure, one thing that we're trying to measure is the effect of missions among indigenous communities in Mexico. And at least for Protestant missions, that didn't start until the late 1930s. We'll have data, at least on some groups, before anyone arrived. And so then you can look at change over time on the census by linking it through time. Because most years we'd only have it at the municipality level. But at least in the first year, we'll have it at every individual.
Referring about the documents we found in the secret archive about the Peru, and then all the documents from Saint Arabius and the following bishops, and
Yes.
all the details that we found at those Relatio Diocesium.
Just to put more lumber on the fire, I'm the head of National Archives in Peru, and most of our 16th century papers, most of them are already described. Many of them are already scanned. Now, we have, of course, the problems to get more servers to provide that information, but we got at least 160 protocols, which is, I don't know how to translate that, have been properly described for the 16th century. And then, of course, many other documents which are, as you say, a gold mine. Do a lot of things.
Yeah.
Well, that's my part of tempting you.
That's very tempting.
Caroline también tenía una pregunta.
Professor Robert, first of all, congratulations for your project. I think that it's an interesting one because here in Peru, we don't have this kind of groups that investigate poverty and the population of people here, right? But my question is focused on this, if you have ever considered a native people, as the teacher before said, this kind of peoples are like forgotten today, nowadays. So nowadays we have this self-determination right, or self-determination right? So we can decide our political, economic, or something like that stuff. So I don't know if you have ever considered that kind of group in your projects.
Definitely. Part of what we're looking at in Mexico is looking at indigenous people and their life condition and how it changes over time. So we can't go back earlier than, with good data, earlier than 1930, but for some data back to 1895, for indigenous communities, to the extent that they were included in the census. And a lot of exploitation happened earlier than that, which we can't measure. But we can measure from starting, let's say, in 1930, how conditions for indigenous communities improves or deteriorates over time. And we can look at, for example, what Protestant missionaries and Catholic religious and the government has done, and whether it is associated with greater language preservation, whether it's associated with better health, with more economic development, etc., among indigenous communities. So that's one of our goals. It would be lovely to do it in Peru or Brazil or anywhere where we can get good data. But one of our goals is to see what things are most helpful for the flourishing of indigenous communities in multiple ways.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. And just to finish, here we have, like in Peru, in our university, that is Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, we have different groups that focuses in this kind of investigations. For example, before our this coronavirus, we have traveled to many places, faraway places, and I have investigated, for example, about this kind of indigenous Ashaninka people here in Peru. And there are a lot of groups in our university that investigate and, of course, have their studies about those kind of groups. So it's interesting maybe to compare your information about Mexico and the information that we have about here in our people, right? So thank you for your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Juan Carlos, Robert, if you think about poverty before the industrial age, before the industrial society, we find small people in the city, big people in the rural areas. If you think 19th century, the age, the common people live 35, 40 years old. Only 5 people 60 or 65 years old. In Latin America, this changed in the middle 20th century. So a lot of people can live in the city, but in the rural areas, no, the health situation, the nutrition could be best than the city. No, this is idea. The poverty could be postmodern idea. The poverty, no, because in traditional idea, of poverty is the rural against the city. No, the goal is no change the live, no change the home. But this idea, the new idea, the poverty, or post-traditional idea, the poverty, I would like to know your idea, the poverty, your concept, the poverty, no, your model, the poverty in this no context.
Right. Well, Juan Carlos, I'd be happy. You should answer too. But we're not trying to limit to a narrow definition of poverty or assume like urbanization or something like that is a good measure, because people can suffer and be poor and be exploited in urban areas also. But we're limited to the things that we can measure, which can be problematic, but we can measure things like life expectancy and infant mortality. We can measure things like light emission, so the amount of electric light that goes into space and is captured by satellites per capita. And that's sort of related to economic development. We can get information about whether people have clean water and the types of toilets and whether they can read, whether they have a school, education, those types of things. There's always a little bit of problem with income measures, particularly when you're talking about rural populations who grow their own food. But our goal is to be as broad as possible to allow and to make the data in a way that it can be linked to as many things as possible, so that if someone has a different idea of what should be included in well-being of someone, it can be linked and measured.
I interested in aspect, for example, the health system now is public and private, but in origins, the health system is connected with the church or religious community. So we can see in 20th century, in middle 20th century, the beginning, the public service. Mm-hmm. In your study, you can identify this change, the community health service, community education service and public education service, in this, in rural, in urban areas. Is possible in your research?
Yeah, Juan Carlos, do you want to speak to that? You know more about
Yeah, I think that's one of the main advantages that we have, particularly for Protestant atlases, because they always report when they have schools, number of teachers, number of students, and exact location of schools. So in such a case, we have very good reports. In case of Catholic providing education, they report that to the Pope, but they do that by the ecclesiastical circumscription that Bob was explaining. So we have some limitation because that's aggregated data, and we cannot have the exact location of each school sometimes, but at least we know if there were schools that they were reporting in that circumscription at any point in time. So that's a huge advantage, particularly when at the second part of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we have a stronger dependency on religious inspired health services provided to the population. And that's something that has proved to be amazingly powerful. Bob has worked that broader at the world level, but that's amazing, the influence that kind of health services have in current health conditions.
Yeah, but we also can look at government provision as well and compare it. So in the 1920s, there's a couple government gazetteers of schools, the locations and names of various schools. And there's some current data where we can get school data and other things like that that can be georeferenced, meaning finding the exact location of it. So it is possible to compare different types of things. We're not just limited to looking at religious interventions.
We really want to have a hand on the Bourbonic census. We were looking at the General Index Archive in Spain, but some of the archivists over there told us that most of those results would be in el Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico or in Peru. Therefore, we have referred from there to here, but that's an amazing source for understanding indigenous distribution and some of indigenous life qualities, since they were reporting how much in terms of tribute should be paid and in terms of tithe. And both depends on the economic, at least the economic situation of the indigenous population. Therefore, that would be a proxy for knowing how well or bad, at least in that level, could be considered the indigenous population to be living.
Or even just the sizes of them. I always worry too of like taxes can also be how much a group is exploited, how much can be extracted from them. So it's both related to how wealthy they are, but also how much they can be forced to give up something. So, you know, I don't know, but like we would love to have anything as early as we can to try and best measure the consequences of different things that were done, and what things were helpful and what things were not helpful.
I don't know if taxes during the Inca and Aztec era were more.
I don't think so either. But still,
during the colonial period.
There's different forms of exploitation and extraction, because mostly for those taxes, they're not getting a lot of social services. But anyways.
Are we talking about the meta system for servitude?
Mm-hmm.